In 1927, the Caldwell estate, nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural Virginia, became a place whispered about in fear and fascination, where opulence and terror coexisted behind its ivy-covered walls. Locals spoke in hushed tones of locked rooms that no servant dared enter, of sudden blood-curdling screams echoing down empty hallways, and of shadows that seemed to move independently of any human presence. The Caldwell family, heirs to generations of wealth and influence, were rumored to conduct strange candlelit ceremonies, blending devout religious observance with superstition, occult practices, and cruelty that blurred the line between ritual and punishment. Visitors occasionally reported inexplicable chills in rooms sealed for decades, a faint scent of incense mixed with something metallic, and the sensation of being watched, even when alone. Contrasts emerged immediately. The estate's grand marble floors and gilded chandeliers juxtaposed with tales of decay, fear, and hidden suffering. Privilege stood against isolation, innocence against malevolence, and civility against acts that seemed impossible to reconcile with law or morality. Newspapers carried fragments of rumors, mysterious disappearances of staff, sudden illnesses with no medical explanation, and whispers of experiments conducted in secret chambers. Yet these reports were frustratingly incomplete, leaving investigators, journalists, and historians to navigate a web of half-truths, speculation, and legend. The estate became a magnet for those drawn to darkness, folklorists seeking ancient echoes of ritual, psychologists fascinated by the interplay of power and manipulation, and thrill-seekers eager to glimpse the forbidden. Every account, whether eyewitness testimony or local gossip, seemed to amplify the mystery, creating a narrative where fact and fiction merged into an unsettling mythos. The Caldwell estate stands as a reminder of the dangerous allure of secrecy, the fragility of human morality under the weight of wealth and authority, and the haunting possibility that some corners of elite society harbor truths that defy comprehension. This introduction sets the stage for a story that intertwines historical record, human psychology, and the supernatural, inviting audiences to confront not only the horror that may have occurred, but also the uncomfortable question of what elites can hide behind gilded doors. In exploring the Caldwell estate, we confront fear, curiosity, and the dark potential lurking within human ambition and privilege. The Caldwell family's rise to prominence in Virginia was emblematic of the power and privilege afforded to a select few during the late 19th century. From plantations that stretched across fertile valleys to banking enterprises that connected them to the broader economic machinery of the South, the family cultivated influence as meticulously as they tended their gardens. Letters and diaries, preserved in the family archives, reveal a household governed with absolute precision, where hierarchy was enforced not merely through authority, but through a culture of expectation and surveillance. Children were educated in isolation, tutored at home under the watchful eye of governesses and private instructors, who reported every misstep, every deviation from the moral code that the Caldwells prized above all else. Servants lived under constant scrutiny, their movements, conversations, and even thoughts, so far as they could be perceived, subject to the ever-present gaze of the family and their stewards. The estate itself, sprawling and architecturally imposing with high walls, wrought iron gates, and corridors that seemed to twist upon themselves, amplified a sense of seclusion. Geographic isolation was no accident. The family deliberately chose a location removed from towns, roads, and prying eyes, creating a fortress of status and secrecy. Folklore, however, clung stubbornly to the land, and not all stories were grounded in reality. Long before the Caldwells claimed the estate, locals whispered of hidden crypts beneath the oldest sections of the manor, of symbols etched into stone that defied conventional explanation, and of unexplained deaths that haunted the surrounding forests. These tales, half forgotten yet persistent, became a shadow over the family's own ambitions, a lens through which outsiders interpreted every strange sound or sudden disappearance. The contrasts were stark from the outset: outward respectability versus private suspicion, immense wealth versus profound isolation, and a veneer of normalcy overlaying anomalies that hinted at darker tendencies. Historians suggest that this combination of inherited fortune, geographic seclusion, and the persistent undercurrent of superstition created fertile ground for rumor, dread, and fear to flourish. Even minor events, an illness among servants, the sudden disappearance of a favored horse, a servant's inexplicable fainting, were magnified into narrative threads that wove a growing tapestry of unease. Within the family, discipline was absolute, yet subtle behaviors revealed cracks beneath the polished surface. Children, though educated in literature, history, and the arts, were encouraged to adopt rigid obedience as a form of virtue. Yet private letters hint at an undercurrent of fear, rebellion, and curiosity forbidden by the weight of expectation. Diaries describe games that bordered on ritualistic, scoldings that edged into cruelty, and punishments that left lasting psychological impressions, though all framed in the language of propriety. Visitors, when admitted, often remarked upon the house's perfection: polished floors, immaculately tended lawns, and elegant rooms filled with rare artworks. Yet even they sensed something intangible, an air of watchfulness, a subtle tension that seemed to thrum beneath the estate's surface. Servants described corridors that twisted unnaturally, rooms that seemed to shift in dimension, and locked chambers that no one dared to open. Even long-term staff spoke of doors that opened on their own, distant whispers when the house was empty, and fleeting shadows that did not correspond to any living figure. These experiences, while anecdotal, contributed to the estate's growing mystique and reputation as a place where the ordinary laws of household management intersected with something darker, something perhaps inherited along with the family fortune. In understanding the lineage of the Caldwells, one observes a recurring pattern of ambition married to secrecy. Letters reveal that patriarchs and matriarchs alike were obsessed with appearances, guarding their reputation with meticulous care, while permitting private indulgences in behavior that, if revealed, would horrify society. The pressure to maintain perfection, combined with the isolation of the estate, may have fostered psychological tendencies that oscillated between genius and mania. Guests often describe the family as charming, erudite, and urbane, yet those closest to the household, servants, tutors, and occasional advisors, reported a pervasive atmosphere of fear and obedience that suggested a household ruled less by love than by surveillance, intimidation, and a subtle but constant assertion of power. Folklorists note that the estate's history provided a fertile canvas for local legend. Stories of spectral figures roaming the halls, of curses laid by displaced families, and of sudden, inexplicable tragedies lent the Caldwells a mythic dimension, blurring the line between history and superstition. Even minor transgressions or unusual behavior became magnified through the prism of rumor, creating a feedback loop where imagination and fear reinforced one another. Social historians argue that the Caldwells' very success relied upon this duality. The family's public persona as paragons of refinement and moral rectitude masked behaviors, obsessions, and traditions that were never meant to see daylight. This tension between external admiration and internal secrecy became a defining characteristic of the estate, shaping the environment in which servants, family members, and visitors lived, observed, and in some cases, suffered. The estate itself, with hidden chambers, sprawling grounds, and cryptic symbols, provided both literal and symbolic spaces where control, ritual, and mystery converged. In these spaces, the boundaries between discipline and cruelty, tradition and obsession, and normalcy and anomaly became increasingly indistinct. The origin story of the Caldwell estate is thus not merely a chronicle of wealth and status. It is a study in the interplay of power, secrecy, and human psychology. By examining the estate's physical isolation, the family's hierarchical structures, and the folklore interwoven with the land itself, one begins to understand how environment, privilege, and secrecy combined to produce a household both admired for its social standing and feared for its hidden, often disturbing dimensions. These factors laid the groundwork for the estate's later reputation as a locus of horror, obsession, and mystery. Every corridor, every locked door, every whispered legend contributes to a narrative in which the Caldwell estate becomes more than architecture. It becomes a symbol of the intersection between human ambition, morality, and the unknowable terrors that flourish when power is combined with secrecy. In understanding these origins, one sees the beginnings of a story where status, fear, and superstition collide, creating a legacy that continues to haunt history and imagination alike. By the second decade of the 20th century, Murmurs about the Caldwell estate had begun to permeate the surrounding villages, carried first in hushed conversations among farmhands, and later into the public consciousness through local gossip. Servants, often young and unaccustomed to the rigid discipline of aristocratic life, whispered of doors that were never opened, of rooms locked for reasons never disclosed, and of late-night assemblies in chambers lit by flickering candlelight. These gatherings, described in diaries and letters now preserved in local archives, often seemed to defy explanation. Participants, when there were any reports at all, spoke of intricate patterns drawn upon floors, symbols that combined religious motifs with abstract forms whose meaning was obscure even to those who witnessed them. The children of the estate, shielded from the wider world, were often at the center of these tales. They sometimes vanished for hours, re-emerging pale, silent, or visibly shaken. In one servant's account, a child returned clutching a small figurine scorched at the edges, yet insisted it was a gift from unseen teachers. In another, a young girl trembled for days after being ordered to remain in a room alone while strange chanting echoed through the walls. These events, though lacking contemporary verification, seeded a growing aura of fear and fascination, which outsiders interpreted through lenses both rational and superstitious. Contrasts emerged sharply. Innocence confronted indoctrination, childhood confronted rigid adult control, and ordinary life collided with enigmatic rituals that blurred the line between education, discipline, and potential abuse. In some testimonies, the rituals appeared almost theatrical, blending symbols, recitations, and precise movements with the cadence of a performance. In others, the actions carried an air of threat, a silent warning that questioning authority, or the logic behind the family's mandates, would not be tolerated. The layering of these impressions created an unstable narrative, one in which the ordinary could suddenly transform into the terrifying without warning. Locals who observed activity near the estate often reported fleeting glimpses, shadows moving along corridors where no one should have been, glimpses of candlelight in windows where rooms had supposedly been empty for decades, and a peculiar chill that accompanied the estate's presence even in the warmth of summer. Animals, too, seemed to respond to this environment. Farmhands recounted horses becoming skittish near certain gates, dogs refusing to approach particular halls, and livestock succumbing suddenly to illnesses that baffled veterinarians. Each unexplained incident, no matter how mundane on its own, fed into a cumulative sense of unease that enveloped the estate like a tangible fog. The Caldwell family's public persona contrasted sharply with these whispers. In daylight, they presented themselves as paragons of refinement, hosting lavish gatherings, attending social functions, and maintaining an image of civility and sophistication. Guests, often carefully vetted, would describe polished floors, rare artworks, and an atmosphere of disciplined elegance. Yet behind these polished veneers, the unseen layers of secrecy seemed to hum with their own logic, one that outsiders could sense but rarely comprehend. This dissonance between perception and reality, public appearance and private conduct, became a fertile ground for speculation. Authorities, though occasionally alerted to incidents, missing children, sudden illnesses, among staff, or complaints of strange noises, were often hesitant to intervene. The Caldwells' wealth and social connections rendered them effectively untouchable. Investigations were either delayed, quietly dismissed, or deflected under the pretense of aristocratic privilege. The tension between law and social influence reinforced the estate's aura of unassailable mystery. Reports compiled by journalists, often sensationalized and interpolated with local folklore, amplified the enigma. Newspapers occasionally featured accounts of the estate as a place where strange rites occurred behind locked doors, describing arcane symbols and unexplained vanishings that seemed to straddle the boundary between the real and the imagined. Letters sent to editors from villagers spoke of shadowy figures, sudden screams in the night, and fleeting apparitions glimpsed at windows that faced overgrown gardens. Some residents, however, offered contrary perspectives, insisting that the estate's reputation was exaggerated, that children wandered off or became ill as they did anywhere else, and that servants' imaginations, or grievances against harsh discipline, had colored their accounts. This clash of narratives created a dynamic tension, where fact and rumor, observation and imagination coalesced into a mythology that would endure long past the immediate events. Within the household, the evidence is equally contradictory. Diaries preserved in family archives recount elaborate codes of behavior, where every action and gesture was measured, recorded, and assessed for compliance with the family's unspoken rules. Yet alongside these meticulous records are notes of play, creativity, and occasional benevolence. A governess recounting the children's laughter during supervised games, or the patriarch showing a rare act of kindness toward a sick servant. These contradictions complicate the historical narrative, challenging modern readers to discern whether the reports of cruelty and occult activity were accurate reflections of behavior or products of human perception, distorted by fear, gossip, and the peculiarities of hierarchical domestic life. Local superstition also played a role in shaping the estate's reputation. The land on which the Caldwells built their mansion had long been associated with tales of hidden crypts, Native American burial sites, and colonial-era tragedies. Folk beliefs intertwined with real-world occurrences. An unexplained illness could be interpreted as a curse, a vanishing horse as a portent, a servant's collapse as evidence of malevolent forces. The blending of these layers of reality and legend produced a feedback loop in which each incident, however minor, reinforced the impression of the Caldwell estate as a locus of forbidden practices. In analyzing these early incidents and rumors, one observes a clear pattern. The convergence of secrecy, wealth, isolation, and superstition created an environment ripe for myth-making. The human tendency to seek explanation for anomalous events, coupled with the power dynamics inherent in the family's control over servants and children, magnified every occurrence, imbuing the estate with a reputation that would persist for generations. By tracing these intertwined threads, we begin to understand how fear, perception, and social context combined to produce an enduring narrative, one in which the Caldwell estate became both a historical subject and a vessel for imagination, morality, and dread. A story where reality and rumor, innocence and manipulation, fact and legend, coalesced into an enduring enigma that would haunt Virginia long after the immediate incidents had passed. The Caldwell estate, already steeped in rumor and whispered terror, became the focus of increasing scrutiny as reports of its unusual practices circulated beyond the confines of rural Virginia. Experts from multiple disciplines attempted to reconcile the strange accounts, each interpreting the events through the lens of their own methodology and biases. Psychologists posited that manipulation and coercion within the household could explain much of what outsiders perceived as supernatural or criminal activity. The children, raised in isolation under strict moral instruction, tutored rigorously yet monitored obsessively, may have internalized an oppressive environment that skewed behavior and perception. Diaries and letters suggest that even routine instruction was punctuated by rituals designed to instill obedience, repeated phrases, symbolic gestures, and exercises framed as both education and moral conditioning. Psychologists argued that such practices, repeated over formative years, could produce heightened suggestibility, anxiety, and dissociative tendencies. Witnesses described children following invisible commands, responding to silent cues, and behaving with an unnatural precision during ceremonies or household routines. These observations, viewed through a psychological lens, implied not malevolent sorcery, but the application of extreme behavioral conditioning, raising uncomfortable questions about the ethics of wealth, authority, and isolation. Criminologists approached the estate from another angle, seeking evidence of deliberate abuse or criminal exploitation. They noted patterns that, while possibly coincidental, suggested an organized imposition of power and control. Sudden illnesses among servants, disappearances of animals, and enigmatic injuries in children were cataloged as potential outcomes of human agency, rather than supernatural influence. Reports from law enforcement archives reveal investigations that were hampered by social constraints. The Caldwell's political connections and public prominence created a formidable barrier to thorough scrutiny. Officers often recorded suspicions, only to be instructed to withdraw or minimize findings. Even when evidence was present, its interpretation was complicated by the family's careful orchestration of appearances. Public displays of generosity, well-maintained gardens, and opulent parties contrasted sharply with the darker, private environment. Criminologists argued that these dualities, charitable visage versus secretive control, reflect a broader pattern in elite households where power and wealth can obscure potentially abusive practices. Here, contrasts dominate. Law versus influence, investigation versus fear, observed fact versus interpreted intention. Occultists, in turn, suggested that the Caldwell family had intentionally harnessed esoteric forces to consolidate control and enhance influence. Accounts of symbolic markings etched into walls, floors, and furniture were interpreted as ritualistic inscriptions, each bearing significance in forgotten mystical traditions. Observers reported hypnotic effects over both children and servants, described as heightened focus or trance-like obedience during certain ceremonies. Folklore interwoven with witness statements suggested the invocation of energy patterns, protection against perceived threats, or the manipulation of fortune and fate. Newspaper articles of the era, often sensationalized, recounted stories of midnight gatherings where whispered chants accompanied flickering candles, producing phenomena that contemporaries found inexplicable. Cold drafts in sealed rooms, sudden shadows, and voices seemingly emerging from empty corridors. Occultists framed these accounts as evidence of a deliberate program of spiritual or magical practice, positing that the Caldwells' reputation for cruelty and eccentricity might have masked an even deeper engagement with hidden forces. The interplay between fact and interpretation created a public discourse rich with speculation and fear. Reports from journalists, folklorists, and amateur investigators blurred these lines further, creating a cultural landscape where psychological manipulation, criminal intent, and supernatural influence existed simultaneously. Newspapers printed interviews with former servants who described rooms that seemed alive with unseen energies, while psychologists cautioned readers that such perceptions were consistent with trauma-induced hallucinations or collective hysteria. Criminologists highlighted patterns of disappearances and anomalies in estate records, emphasizing that wealth and secrecy could conceal severe misconduct. Meanwhile, accounts circulated in local folklore connected the estate to regional legends of curses, spirits, and ancestral vendettas. In the absence of definitive proof, each observer interpreted the estate according to their own framework, projecting societal anxieties onto the Caldwells' secluded environment. Contrasts dominate. These narratives, rationality versus fear, logic versus ritual, psychological conditioning versus mystical intervention. The same incidents, children returning pale and silent from locked rooms, servants claiming to hear whispered commands, objects mysteriously displaced, could be interpreted as evidence of either human cruelty or supernatural influence depending on the observer's predispositions. The interplay between science and superstition was further complicated by the psychological phenomena of suggestion and rumor. Accounts circulated in local newspapers and letters often contained embellishments, consciously or unconsciously inserted by witnesses eager to make sense of the incomprehensible. Servants' diaries recorded the fear of being observed or judged, sometimes attributing ordinary events to ritualistic causes. These accounts, while subjective, became primary sources for later researchers, blurring the distinction between observation and interpretation. Anthropologists studying elite family structures noted that extreme hierarchy, isolation, and secrecy are environments where perception and reality frequently diverge. Behavioral patterns considered abusive or manipulative in one context might be dismissed as discipline in another, and small acts of cruelty, punishments for disobedience, enforced isolation, or emotional manipulation, could be transformed in memory or retelling into tales of malevolence or mystical coercion. The estate thus becomes a mirror reflecting broader cultural anxieties, fear of power unrestrained, of privilege untouchable, and of human psychology operating beyond moral and social constraints. Media coverage amplified these dynamics. Headlines emphasized arcane practices and hidden horrors, drawing readers into narratives that combined observable events with cultural mythology. Letters to editors, gossip columns, and even fictionalized novels borrowed elements from these accounts, further entwining the estate's public image with folklore. Social psychologists observe that repeated narratives, particularly those emphasizing fear and the unknown, reinforce collective memory in ways that obscure verification. The Caldwell estate, in this sense, became a canvas onto which society projected its anxieties, the dangers of unchecked authority, the corrupting influence of wealth, and the fragile boundary between rational explanation and superstition. Each interpretation, psychological, criminological, or occult, offers partial truth, illuminating some facets while leaving central questions unresolved. The estate itself remains a symbol of this tension, a locus where the human need for explanation collides with the enduring allure of mystery. By examining the overlapping lenses of science, superstition, and psychological influence, one observes a profound interplay between environment, perception, and interpretation. Trauma, authority, ritual, and fear combine to create a milieu where ordinary events could assume extraordinary significance. Observers interpreted the same phenomena in vastly different ways. Psychologists saw manipulation and conditioned responses. Criminologists inferred intent and potential crime. Occultists discerned mystical purpose. Public fascination grew in tandem with ambiguity, each retelling amplifying both horror and curiosity. The estate, though materially unchanged, evolved into a legend, a space in which the known and unknown intertwined. The uncertainty surrounding these events illustrates a broader principle. When secrecy, power, and anomaly converge, interpretation becomes as critical as observation. The Caldwell estate is not merely a historical site. It is a prism reflecting humanity's struggle to reconcile fear, morality, and the unknowable. Every candlelit corridor, every shadow in a sealed room, and every cryptic symbol serves as a reminder that some mysteries persist precisely because they resist resolution, inviting perpetual debate, contemplation, and unease. The Caldwell estate, already enveloped in layers of rumor and suspicion, became a stage on which human perception, memory, and fear intersected, producing a tapestry of testimonies as varied as they were enigmatic. Former servants, who spent years under the ever-watchful eye of the Caldwell family, provided some of the earliest accounts of life behind the estate's ornate doors. Many recalled strict routines, seemingly trivial rules enforced with meticulous precision, and punishments for minor infractions that instilled a sense of perpetual vigilance. Some described children being isolated for hours in locked rooms, their return marked by pallor, silence, and a trembling composure that hinted at trauma. Others noted that the children were engaged in strange exercises or rituals that appeared innocuous but carried undertones of psychological conditioning. These accounts suggested a household in which authority, hierarchy, and fear coalesced, creating an environment in which obedience was demanded not just of body, but of thought and emotion. Yet, even among these accounts, contradictions emerged. Some former staff remembered moments of genuine kindness, rewards for diligence, and instances of familial warmth that seemed at odds with tales of cruelty. This duality, acts of benevolence shadowed by whispers of malevolence, established the first layer of complexity in understanding life within the estate, forcing observers to confront the unsettling possibility that appearances, even for those living within, could be deceptive. The contrasts are immediate and jarring: innocence versus corruption, routine versus manipulation, loyalty versus fear. Neighbors and itinerant workers, who came into sporadic contact with the estate, contributed an equally perplexing layer of narrative. Some reported hearing screams echoing through the night, the sound amplified across the quiet, wooded landscape surrounding the property. Others observed figures moving in and out of the estate at unusual hours, often accompanied by the flicker of candlelight through curtained windows. These witnesses, lacking intimate knowledge of the household's internal hierarchies, interpreted what they saw and heard through the lens of their own expectations and fears. A local carpenter, for instance, recalled repairing a fence at dusk when he glimpsed children standing silently at the windows, watching him with a blank intensity that he described as unnatural. In contrast, a neighboring farmer remembered the same children playing in the gardens during daylight hours, laughing and carefree, offering fruit from the orchard to those who passed by. Such contrasting testimonies illustrate the difficulty of reconciling external observation with internal reality, highlighting the ways in which perception is shaped not only by what is seen, but by the observer's preconceptions, social position, and emotional state. Personal diaries and letters from both staff and family members provide an intimate, though sometimes unreliable, window into life at Caldwell. One maid wrote of the family's strict adherence to secrecy, noting that even minor curiosity could be met with cold disapproval or swift reprimand. She described hidden doors behind bookshelves, corridors that seemed to shift when unobserved, and rooms that were forbidden to all except those chosen to enter. Another servant's letter recounted being asked to prepare elaborate tableaux for evening gatherings in which children and staff performed actions that seemed ritualistic, though the purpose remained obscure. These accounts, when compared, reveal a fascinating tension. What one individual interpreted as ceremonial, another perceived as cruel or manipulative. Historians analyzing these primary sources emphasize that such discrepancies are not merely errors of memory. They reflect the influence of personal bias, emotional trauma, and hierarchical pressure, which together shape the stories that survive in historical record. Every narrative, filtered through fear, reverence, or survival instinct, contributes to a collective image of the estate that is as fragmented as it is compelling. Eyewitness affidavits collected during sporadic investigations amplify the contradictions further. One former gardener, called upon decades later, testified that he had seen gatherings in which children moved in coordinated, almost hypnotic patterns around the estate grounds, chanting words that seemed foreign or arcane. He claimed to have observed objects arranged in geometric patterns and symbols etched into walls and floors, yet when questioned about meaning or intent, he admitted uncertainty. Contrastingly, a cook remembered quiet, uneventful evenings where children practiced music or recited poetry under the guidance of tutors, with no hint of ritualistic behavior. These divergent recollections underscore the role of selective memory, social influence, and personal interpretation in shaping witness testimony. Even when observing the same individuals in the same spaces, the human mind imposes narratives that align with prior beliefs, fears, and expectations, creating an inherent unreliability in any single account. Local folklore and oral history, intertwined with first-hand narratives, further blurring the line between observation and imagination. Stories circulated of hidden passages beneath the estate, secret chambers where clandestine meetings occurred, and midnight ceremonies whose purpose was never fully revealed. Some villagers spoke of seeing fleeting shadows that seemed to possess a life independent of those inhabiting the house, while others insisted they had glimpsed spectral figures of children long deceased, wandering the gardens in perpetual play. Scholars of folklore argue that such accounts often reflect collective anxiety projected onto spaces of power and mystery. The Caldwell estate, isolated and imposing, became a canvas upon which imagination painted scenarios of cruelty, ritual, and supernatural influence, magnifying the impact of otherwise mundane events. A simple argument between a child and a tutor might be remembered as a sinister confrontation, a late-night candlelit study session recast as an occult ceremony, and the eerie echo of footsteps in empty halls interpreted as ghostly activity. These narratives demonstrate how human perception, memory, and culture coalesce to produce enduring legends. The psychological dimensions of witness accounts are equally revealing. Many testimonies suggest that fear, trauma, and hierarchical, pressure-conditioned responses, shaping not only behavior but memory itself. Children, acutely aware of the consequences of disobedience, may have internalized lessons of silence, obedience, and concealment, which later manifested in enigmatic behavior that observers misinterpreted. Servants, acutely aware of social standing and potential repercussions, may have selectively emphasized or downplayed experiences in letters and diaries, conscious or unconscious of the need to navigate authority while preserving personal safety. These factors combine to create a rich, though unreliable, narrative landscape in which objective truth is nearly impossible to isolate. Each account offers fragments, hints, and impressions, yet none can fully convey the complexities of daily life within the estate. The contrasts, perception versus reality, innocence versus corruption, fear versus respect, remain central to understanding the legacy of the Caldwell estate, illustrating how human experience, memory, and interpretation intersect to create stories that endure long after events have passed. Ultimately, witness accounts, diaries, letters, and oral histories converge to produce a tableau of ambiguity and fascination. The Caldwell estate emerges as both historical artifact and psychological locus, where social hierarchy, isolation, ritualized behavior, and human imagination intertwine. The conflicting narratives compel audiences to confront the nature of truth, the reliability of perception, and the ways in which fear and moral judgment shape the stories we tell. By examining these testimonies collectively, one sees that the estate's enduring power lies not merely in the events themselves, but in the persistent uncertainty, the interplay of belief and observation, and the haunting contradictions that refuse resolution. The estate, through the eyes of those who lived, worked, and observed there, remains a site of enduring intrigue, a monument to human fascination with secrecy, authority, and the limits of comprehension, forever challenging the line between history and legend, reality and imagination. Over the decades, the Caldwell estate has evolved into a locus of enduring mystery, its history interpreted through lenses as diverse as anthropology, psychology, folklore, and criminology, each seeking to impose meaning upon events that may, ultimately, defy explanation. Scholars and enthusiasts alike have attempted to unravel the tangled web of rumor, observation, and narrative, yet the more one examines the estate, the more contradictions emerge, highlighting the human compulsion to find patterns amid chaos. Some argue that the family's behavior was rooted in criminal calculation, a deliberate exercise of power disguised as tradition. They point to accounts of missing servants, the sudden disappearance of livestock, and the presence of locked rooms that none but the family could enter. These theorists suggest that the Caldwell's wealth and social position provided both the means and the immunity to commit acts that ordinary individuals could not, their elite privilege shielding them from accountability while allowing them to orchestrate coercion, intimidation, and manipulation. Such interpretations emphasize rational analysis, cause and effect, opportunity and motive, observable patterns in behavior, and the alignment of reported incidents over time. In this framework, the estate becomes a case study in calculated immorality, a reminder of how concentrated power can facilitate acts both hidden and morally ambiguous. Yet even within this rationalist lens, uncertainty persists. Documents are incomplete, testimonies contradictory, and physical evidence scarce, leaving gaps that imagination readily fills. Here, contrast dominates. The search for logical causality versus the presence of inexplicable occurrences, ethical scrutiny versus secrecy, observable behavior versus hidden intent. Others turn to the domain of the occult or the supernatural to explain the Caldwell legacy. From the first whispered accounts of midnight rituals and cryptic symbols, to later reports of shadows moving in forbidden rooms, occult theorists assert that the family may have sought influence beyond conventional means. Esoteric practitioners, folklorists, and popular writers speculate that the Caldwells employed ritualized ceremonies to manipulate human behavior, harness unseen forces, or bind loyalty through fear. They interpret the locked rooms not merely as a symbol of privilege, but as spaces of spiritual or mystical significance, where forbidden knowledge was both practiced and protected. In this reading, the estate becomes a theater for forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Symbols etched in walls may encode secret wisdom, nocturnal gatherings may summon or redirect energies, and patterns of obedience among servants and children could be understood as the result of ritualistic conditioning. Here, the contrasts are stark: rational explanation versus legend, human versus supernatural, observable events versus metaphysical interpretation. Every anecdote is refracted through the prism of possibility. A scream at night may be cruelty, or it may mark a boundary between realms. A locked room may hide punishment, or it may conceal knowledge forbidden to common eyes. Such interpretations highlight how cultural fascination with the mysterious amplifies perception, allowing myth to coalesce around fragments of truth and selective memory. Anthropologists, in contrast, examine the estate as a microcosm of elite privilege, power dynamics, and hierarchical social structure. The Caldwell family, they argue, embodies a form of inherited authority that allowed for both the exertion of control and the insulation from scrutiny. Servants' testimonies, diaries, and letters are read not simply as windows into isolated horrors, but as reflections of systemic imbalance, the interplay of wealth, status, and social expectation. In this framework, ritualized behavior, whether seemingly sinister or superficially ceremonial, functions as a reinforcement of hierarchy, teaching obedience, instilling fear, and delineating social boundaries. Children raised within the estate absorbed lessons of deference and vigilance. Outsiders observed patterns of behavior that were interpreted as mystical or cruel, but which may have been equally about maintaining order, projecting dominance, and controlling perception. The contrasts here, authority versus subservience, elite privilege versus vulnerability, expectation versus autonomy, demonstrate how human psychology and social structure intersect, creating conditions where extraordinary behavior may emerge, and where the observer, whether local or historian, is compelled to reconcile apparent malevolence with the ordinary mechanics of power. Psychologists and behavioral theorists similarly analyze the estate, focusing on coercion, trauma, and the shaping of individual identity under conditions of sustained pressure. Many testimonies suggest that children, servants, and even family members internalized fear, secrecy, and ritual, creating a psychological environment in which obedience and compliance were intertwined with self-preservation. Hypnotic suggestion, subtle manipulation, and ritualized reinforcement may have created patterns of behavior misinterpreted as supernatural or criminal by external observers. Here, the contrast between innocence and corruption, autonomy and influence is evident. Even those not directly engaged in ritualistic behavior were affected by the ambient tension, the implicit threat, and the power dynamics that govern daily life. Scholars of trauma suggest that some reports of hallucinations, spectral sightings, and inexplicable phenomena may reflect the psychological imprint of prolonged exposure to fear and secrecy, demonstrating how human perception itself can become a source of mystery and legend. In this reading, the estate is not only a site of potential immorality or esotericism, but also a psychological crucible where ordinary individuals' responses to authority, fear, and ambiguity generate the stories that endure long after the events themselves. Folklorists emphasize the interplay between rumor, cultural anxiety, and narrative creation. The Caldwell estate, isolated and imposing, became a repository for community fears, moral judgments, and speculation about the unknown. Each incident, whether a missing child, a mysterious illness, or an unusual nocturnal event, was filtered through local imagination, expanding in scope and terror as it passed from witness to witness. These narratives were codified into oral histories, journalistic accounts, and later retellings, blending fact and fiction until distinction was nearly impossible. Here, contrast emerges between observed reality and collective imagination, individual testimony, and societal projection. The estate functions as a mirror, reflecting communal concerns about elite authority, the nature of evil, and the vulnerability of the powerless. Its enduring mystique owes as much to the social psychology of storytelling as to any observable event within its walls. Over time, media representations, books, newspaper articles, and more recently, online discussions have amplified the estate's reputation, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fascination. Each retelling, each speculative essay or sensationalized headline adds layers of interpretation while leaving the core mystery unresolved. Audiences, drawn by both curiosity and the thrill of horror, participate in the narrative, speculating about criminal intent, occult practice, psychological coercion, or simple misfortune. The contrasts persist. Rational deduction versus imaginative projection, innocence versus exploitation, law versus secrecy. The estate remains a locus of unresolved questions, a testament to the enduring human fascination with the forbidden, the powerful, and the unknowable. Each interpretation, while offering partial insight, inevitably raises further questions, ensuring that the Caldwell estate continues to haunt historians, enthusiasts, and casual observers alike. Its power lies not only in what occurred within its walls, but in how human perception, belief, and imagination have preserved, amplified, and complicated its story across generations. By examining these theories collectively, one sees that the mystique of Caldwell is inseparable from the human tendency to seek meaning in uncertainty, to project fears and hopes onto spaces imbued with secrecy, and to perpetuate legends that resist resolution. The estate, therefore, is both historical reality and cultural symbol, a dark mirror reflecting our fascination with elite transgression, hidden knowledge, and the liminal space between fact and myth. The Caldwell estate endures as an emblem of fear, secrecy, and the human compulsion to confront what cannot be easily explained. Its vast corridors, hidden chambers, and forbidden rooms have long whispered of acts that may have occurred beyond the scrutiny of law or morality, leaving a lingering impression that merges history with legend. Visitors, historians, and storytellers alike are drawn to its enigmatic legacy, compelled to decipher fragments of evidence while wrestling with the amplifying power of rumor and imagination. Shadows cast across opulent walls seem to carry secrets, and every creaking floorboard, sudden chill, or muffled sound rekindles the tension between what is seen and what is feared. Some insist that the Caldwell family engaged in calculated cruelty, manipulating servants' children, and even one another in ways designed to consolidate power or satisfy hidden compulsions. Others argue that ordinary behaviors, when viewed through the lens of wealth, isolation, and societal expectation, became exaggerated by superstition, rumor, and collective imagination. Still, a few claim the involvement of forces beyond comprehension, suggesting that the estate was not merely a site of human intrigue, but a space where ritual and occult practice intersected with the material world. Contrasts dominate the narrative: innocence versus malevolence, privilege versus vulnerability, fact versus legend, rationality versus occultism. Every doorway, staircase, and locked room becomes a site of tension, representing both the tangible and the symbolic, the documented and the imagined. Its silence is as loud as its history, provoking reflection on morality, human psychology, and the mechanisms by which fear perpetuates itself across generations. Stories of whispered chants, sudden disappearances, and shadowed figures persist because they appeal to fundamental anxieties. That power can corrupt absolutely, that wealth can shield wrongdoing, and that some acts may evade understanding entirely. The estate's enduring mystique illustrates how the human mind amplifies the unknown, projecting fears and obsessions onto spaces imbued with secrecy. No single theory satisfies the narrative. Each retelling, each new interpretation, only multiplies uncertainty. Perhaps the Caldwell's secrets remain locked behind the estate's gilded doors, waiting to be discovered by some daring historian or curious intruder. Perhaps they have been lost forever, scattered into rumor, imagination, and the fragmentary records of servants and neighbors. The estate itself becomes a mirror, reflecting not only what may have occurred within its walls, but also our enduring obsession with darkness, transgression, and the unknown. Its corridors carry echoes of human ambition, cruelty, and fascination with the forbidden, reminding us that some mysteries are compelling precisely because they resist resolution. The Caldwell estate remains a testament to humanity's simultaneous fear and fascination with power, secrecy, and moral ambiguity. Its legacy endures as an open-ended question, haunting observers with a chilling uncertainty. What truly transpired within its walls, and how much of the horror we imagine was ever reality, and how much still lies hidden behind the doors that have never and may never be opened.